Hey, what's going on, everyone? Stopping by once again to chat with my friend Nathaniel. Hey, Nathaniel.
Hey,
So, we wanted to, well, we were talking on Skype a little while ago, and Nathaniel mentioned something that happened to him, which I'll let him get into. But this conversation is going to be about tribalism and intercultural slash interracial slash interethnic relationships.
hmm
Something that he has an experience with now, and something that I've been thinking about. And I was planning on making a video about this eventually, and I still might. But I guess I'll cover some of my thoughts now. I'm in a relationship with a black woman, and some people don't like that. But why don't you just start with the story you told me about what happened to you?
yeah, yeah. Recently, I was thinking about something that happened to me a little while back, and basically, it went that I was in a synagogue, not my own, but I was in a synagogue a little ways from my house, and it was during a holiday, and I'm talking with people, I'm doing the usual social thing that normal people do. I never really understood the whole thing about that, but I was talking with someone, and I let slip uh, that I had a girlfriend, and it was kind of an interesting thing because the first thing that this person asked me was whether she was Jewish or not. It's just that was the first thing that this person wanted to know. I thought, I mean, I always knew that there was a sort of tribalism within the Jewish community, and it always bugged me. I mean, the intense amount of tribalism and keeping things within line, which by the way is why a lot of Ashkenazim have so many defects, is precisely because keeping it within the Jewish thing. It's because you started to have interbreeding, which is why you have stuff like Tay-Sachs disease.
Hmm.
But one of the things is that the first thing that this person asked was whether she was Jewish, and I mean, I kind of dismissed it as oh well, more Jewish tribalism. But the more I thought about it, the more it disturbed me because I've encountered this sort of stuff before, but this time it really just hit home. Especially probably because I've discussed actually this topic with Stardust, and it was I mean that happened about what about 6 months ago. I would recommend you check that those talks out. I talk about it, actually talk with him twice, and both times we discussed this a little bit. But yeah, I always thought that was a little bit weird because I mean it was just I was just kind of surprised because it wasn't what she liked, or even just ignoring it. They had to know, this person had to know whether she was Jewish or not.
Hmm. Are you sure that it wasn't just an innocent question? Maybe
No,
she
there
was just
was
making small talk.
no, there was definitely. I mean, it was like right after I said that. It was, you have a girlfriend? You have a girlfriend? Uh, and then when I say yes, it's like, oh well, well, is she Jewish? And he's just that's what when she heard me say that those were the two first questions out of her mouth. I mean, and it was asked with relative amount of intensity. I'm not very good with reading people, but that was actually relatively transparent.
Hmm. And how well do you know her?
I barely know her, honestly. I mean, I've only met her that one time, but I mean, I know someone who is overly interested in a topic when when I see them.
Hmm. Yeah. So, like I said earlier, I'm in an interracial relationship, and I've never, nothing ever direct like that, save for one incident at a bar where a particularly insecure black dude started complaining to me. And God, this guy was such a freaking worm. I'm thinking about him right now. He was clearly very insecure, so I
Mhm.
didn't really find myself getting offended. But he was accusing me of polluting the black race, um, stealing their women, and how you white men always have to, how white guys always end up taking the high functioning black females out of the dating pool. But there is an element of truth to that, to in his defense, I guess. But yeah. So, do you think? Well, I'm always have a hard time getting too critical of people's reactions like that, because it's, to an extent, it's just human nature, and I guess that's, what a revolutionary thing to say. But no, it's to a certain extent, people are always going to feel attached to their own females or their own males, and they're going to want to enforce that tribal loyalty among others. So, do you think there's a benefit to that at all, or maybe not benefit too strong, or do you think there's any legitimacy to, let's
Yeah.
say, the guy says, all right, I want to keep our group,
Mhm.
let's say, coherent, for lack of a better term.
Okay. Here's one thing that I've noticed, at least from my experiences with dealing with the people I've dealt with. First of all, I mean, both of us are Yanks, so both of us, come from essentially a culture where essentially it's all based on ideas. It's based on ideals and ideas. It's not based on any particular ethnicity. However, I also happen to interact and be a member of a culture where it's definitely ethnocentric. Now, I do think that there is a value to it to a certain extent, mainly having to do with preservation of culture. You see, cultural traditions tend to be passed down from generation to generation, and those traditions are a lot easier to preserve if you keep it within the family. Also, I would argue that there is some legitimacy in certain, at least there is. I understand why certain people within, for example, the Jewish or Gypsy community think the way they do about this. People who survived the Holocaust tend to be very adamant about keeping things within the Jewish tribe, or in the case of the Rom, the Rom. And there is legitimacy to that because
I'm sorry, my goyim is showing. What's the ROM?
the Rom, Gypsy.
Oh, okay.
It's another term for, and in both of those cases, Hitler did mark them for extermination. And in those cases, I can understand the desire to keep the culture alive by making sure that Jews are marrying Jews, so that you keep the culture going and that you keep the traditions going. Because, of course, there's a huge concern about the traditions going away. I always found it ironic that I, who consider myself much more of an American than I ever do a Jew, am actually keeping the Jewish traditions a lot more alive than most young people who consider themselves Jewish before all other things. But I mean, the thing is, when I look at that, I can understand and sympathize. I don't think that's the right approach, but I can sympathize with that attitude. But the person I was talking with was relatively young. I mean, she clearly did not survive the Holocaust. So, but I do think that there is legitimacy in certain cases, and again, there is a rationale to it which is somewhat legitimate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned kind of preserving culture, and the initial interest in this subject for me was, it's pretty hard being in an interracial relationship and getting interested or invested or investigating into the alt-right and that whole rabbit hole. This isn't really a discussion about the alt-right specifically.
Yeah.
But it has made me think about the usefulness of that kind of enforcement. Like I said earlier, the enforcing of sort of consistent boundaries. But I, they're gonna get mad at me. I'm gonna cut out here, but I can't really see why I should. If I find someone of a different race who my personality and my values are way more attached to, or way more compatible with,
Exactly.
then I'm gonna go with them rather than, I don't know, the strawberry blonde Scandinavian girl over there, who's yeah, I guess we're keeping that Aryan tradition alive there, but maybe she's just crazy, maybe she's a feminist,
Yeah.
maybe she maybe she, I don't know, thinks single moms are heroic, and oh boy, that's totally the opposite of what I think.
Yep. Exactly. I think, but again, you and I are both Americans, which means that we tend to value values more than we do race. And I mean, I think that at a gut level, we get this idea of we need to keep values alive. It's not so much about, race. And I mean, in this case, the reason why I'm dating this person who is ethnically Eastern European, and who is most certainly um, not Jewish, and is not even religious, but she holds the same values that I do and has the same life goals, etc. I mean, who am I going to pick? The Jewish girl who's a freaking dirty commie, or the as certain people would term it, the shiksa, who actually I have something in common with, and who I could actually live with rather than someone who I really can't. I mean, at a certain level, I mean, I really give more of a damn about preserving American culture, which is, in my opinion, the superior culture, over and values especially, than I do about preserving a tradition which I think has kind of gone to crap, and with people who definitely have basically perverted the values to no end, to the point where they think communism is beneficial somehow.
Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, not everyone, but there is a heavy element of that.
Oh, I'm well aware.
Yeah.
But so what would you say? Now, I used to reject this completely, but I'm not entirely sure anymore. I just want to get your thoughts on it. What would you say
Yeah.
to someone who said, "Well, it's nice that you want to preserve the values, but values, to some extent, are they're a downstream product of a certain ethnicity or a certain race or whatever term you want to use." What would you say to kind of that argument?
Yeah, that was something that I was recently thinking about, and honestly, I think there is water to that theory, but I don't think it. I think that there's water to it in a very different sense than a lot of people think there is. You see, what I do notice is that, for example, political values, no matter how you're raised, often tend and not only political values but social values tend to manifest themselves in the genetics of the person. But I do not think it has to do with ethnicity. I think it has to do with family and and perhaps certain types of. I'm not very well versed in biology. I'm sorry, but I don't know the proper term. But essentially, I think it has more to do with um, familial genetics than I think it has to do with ethnic genetics. Because at a certain level, there's too much variation in terms of set worldview to really get that. For example, I mean, my mother believes in a god. I really don't. I mean, I can't ascribe to that notion simply because I don't have that deep set, undeniable belief which she has. So you can see that even within the generation, there are heavy differences, and if there's heavy differences with that, and if the base assumptions are the only ones that stay the same familially, then I mean that sort of underlies the whole notion. And then you have to explain things where, for example, you have black conservatives and black liberals, and you have people who are black who are very traditionalist and people who are freaking communist. I mean, it it kind of dissolves once you start to actually look at the various races or ethnicities even. And I mean, I would be very curious to know whether there is actually a breakup in terms of, for example, Ethiopians being more conservative and Zulus being more liberal. I would be very curious, but I doubt they're going to find anything. Simply because within Judaism, even though I make the joke about the communists and about values which tend to be more and Jewish leftiness, there still are a lot of Jewish right wingers. I mean, that's simply a fact. Now, of course, the values do tend to be more in terms of communal obligation, which is my main issue, as I said. But yeah, I mean, the theory kind of breaks up once you start to actually analyze. Basically, put reality just doesn't hold up with the theory.
I think there's more evidence than maybe you do. Whenever you see, I was going to say third world populations, but that's a bit too broad. We'll just stick with kind of African populations. Um, you keep consistently seeing certain behavior, even when there is, you know, theoretically no contact or influence from, you know, two disparate African populations. For instance, you can look at Britain and you can look at the crime rate of, let's say, African British people who live there, and you can say that it's kind of high. Well, it is kind of high. It's higher than the average. I forget exactly what it is. And of course, you go to America and you see a very similar thing. Most of Africa, same situation. It's like, well, if you take a population and you put them all across the world, and you're seeing the same phenomenon, and the culture, and no matter how different the culture is, it's the same consistent actions taking place, the same events taking place, then, well, logically, the common denominator would be their heritage, their sort of genetic lineage. So
Well, there's oh sorry.
you go.
Well, there's one issue, which is that you have to take into account why it is that, for example, people who are middle class who are black tend to act the same way that middle class people who are white tend to act, and why lower class people who are black tend to in rural areas tend to act the same way lower class people who are white tend to act in rural areas. The issue is that, and I'm probably going to get a lot of flack about this, but the solitary thing Marx did get right is that class does matter. Class matters in the sense that it does influence sometimes the way you think and the way you act. If you are lower class, you're going to probably act in a very different way to someone who's upper class. Look right now at what's going on. The upper class of Europe and the US, in fact, upper class generally, tends to be more globalist, tends to want to basically promote business, international business. The lower class really freaking doesn't, because, and the lower class tends to be more crime prone, etc., whereas the middle class tends to, again, you can see all of this, and yet a lot of people tend to think that, for whatever reason, it has to do with race. Again, I think they're conflating race and class, because middle class people who are black and the upper class people who are black don't act the same way as lower class people who are black. And again, you go to Glasgow and go to some of the seedier neighborhoods there, I expect that you'll probably see people acting in at least somewhat similar ways to people who live in Oakland right now act. It's a little bit more complex than just race. There are other factors having to do with
Yeah,
nurture.
I just to make sure everyone understands, I wasn't trying to argue that it's only race. I see it as it's an element that maybe people don't look into enough, but it's not the only element. Now, about people of different classes having similar behaviors, that's definitely true. But when you mention class, and by extension income, income overlaps to a very significant degree to average IQ. And I mean, the average IQ differences do tend to be different. I think it's like 50 to 80% heritage, and 20% to 50%, whatever the exact breakdown is. You see people who have similar IQs mingling pretty well with each other, who also have like the same average, about the same intelligence. But since there's a disparate spread of, the averages themselves are different, it still comes back to, well, there is sort of there is a, trying to think of the right word, there's just a tendency for people of certain races to behave certain ways. It's not everywhere and it's not all the time, but that's definitely the I just I just don't see how class can influence people's behavior more than their genetics. I just don't see the evidence for that. I don't see how whether or not you're extremely comfortable financially is going to alter your behavior more than whether or not, let's say, you have a genetic predisposition towards alcoholism. if you have
Right,
a
but
disposition towards like alcoholism, you're going to drink whether you're poor or rich.
right, but here's the one issue is that if you actually look at the history of Africa, etc., and I hate to bring up this term because it's been so overused by liberals and idiots in general, and that term is colonialism. And what I mean by that is that it was a situation where African people have always been in, shall we say, lower class positions within the colonial society. Not everywhere from what I remember, but basically that was the trend, right? This means that you're going to naturally have a situation where even when you're quote unquote liberated, you're going to have what's termed a slave mentality. So yes, the reason why African countries are extremely poor has a lot also to do with historical situation and history, as well as and to a much lesser extent possibly race. I don't know, but when you also look at the U.S., I mean, then you have the slave, you have actual slavery, and then they get freed from that. But then, of course, you have these, years where they're subject to inferior treatment, etc. So, how much of this is caused by race? Honestly, I really don't know. But it does seem like there are many more that if race is a factor, it's a very minor factor. It stands to reason that there is some, you're going to have certain bell curves for each one. But the question is how much of that is actual or is actual genetics, and how much of it is actual is has to do with nurturing and with with how people are raised and what environment they're raised. I mean, in the UK, there still was this perception for many years, although not so much now, that Black people were inferior. Now, if my hypothesis is right, within the next couple hundred years, you're going to start to see the situation of Black people improving. That is, if universities can stop telling them that they're oppressed and just should bend the knee to the government. But, and I'm perfectly open to the possibility that I'm wrong. But I say that there is still there's still been way too little divergence of situation with the various races to really tell at this point. And I might point out that with respect to race, right, the Chinese generally are in much worse situations than the Japanese. And I mean, that has to do a lot with nature as opposed to, or sorry, that has a lot more to do with nurture in a communist system than it does to do with genetics.
Mm-hmm. Sorry about that. I had to check my phone. I want to pivot a little bit back to the topic of whatever relationships.
Of course.
Really, everything you said was pretty reasonable. I just haven't. I didn't prepare for that discussion, so I don't want to sound like an idiot.
No worries.
When you're talking about something that serious.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, honestly, I'm just talking out of my tuchus as well, so no worries.
That's my life motto. Oh, Cater Endless left as a comment. Primary problem with colonialism was that it. The primary problem with colonialism was that it ended. Well, I don't know.
Okay.
I've seen. Well, I've seen. I have not looked into this deeply, so I could make myself look like the mighty fool here. But I have seen some evidence that shows that the quality of life in former colonies, now the third world, was on average better under European rule than self-rule. I mean, look,
I mean, actually,
the
that's
Chinese,
partially.
the Chinese can probably run the economy more efficiently than Europeans can in Europe. But it doesn't mean that I think the kind of raw extra, let's say, GDP that the Chinese would give to ruling over the Europeans would be fair to the Europeans. So I don't know. It's something I have to look into more. I don't want to say much else.
Yeah. But going back to interracial and I guess intercultural relationships. I mean, again, the issue does. I mean, I do tend to think that intercultural relationships sometimes can be and often are a bad idea simply because the values held by people are too different. For example, if someone from say let's say France and Brazil were to decide to have a relationship, I would have very serious doubts that that relationship would last long unless there are some very firm ideas about what what is right, what is wrong, what is acceptable, what is not, etc. I saw this actually when I was in Japan. I saw this joke video about dating Brazilians, and the whole commentary was basically on how different Brazil is from Japan and how difficult it is to be married slash have a relationship with someone who is from Brazil if you're from Japan, simply because the cultures are incompatible. It's very similar. I mean, in your case, obviously, both of you are Americans, and both of you therefore have certain common cultural attitudes, I would expect. And in my, I guess I'm being kind of a hypocrite since I'm actually dating someone who comes from a completely different culture. Difference is, of course, that the beautiful thing about American culture is really you just have to hold certain values and understand certain very basic things, which this person does. So, I mean, it's a situation where, though they tend to be bad, if there are certain common understood things, then it tends to be okay.
I'm glad you mentioned the chance that that interracial relationships. I'm just going to say interracial just to be simple. The chances that interracial relationships aren't going to succeed, because it is true to a large extent. There's not a whole lot of data that I've personally sifted through. So if you happen to know, leave a comment. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and all that. But the evidence that I have seen about this subject is that every interracial pairing tends to have lower marriage rates than the white couples, like the averages, except for some reason, and I don't know why, but I have seen some data that shows that white male and black female relationships have a higher chance of having a successful marriage than the white averages, which I do find very interesting. That it's out of step with the trend. I don't really know for sure why. I mean, I have some ideas. I think partly it's because women tend to do better in the marketplace, in like the job marketplace, particularly in the cities, when they put off having kids, and they tend to be more conformist, so they succeed more in like corporate environments, etc. So black women tend to get at a higher rate than, let's say, black males. They tend to get into middle class positions, and the dating pool for black males in that social environment is fairly low. So I think that acts. This is just an idea, but I think that acts as a way of checking women's hypergamy. So when they get into a relationship with a white male, they're more likely to see it through. Like they're more likely to try to make it work, because there might not just be very many functional other functional black males that they can have relationships with, and there aren't very many white men who are attracted to black women overall. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on that before I kept going.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting topic, and I actually have an explanation which explains at least part of it. First of all, the reason why most interracial couplings don't tend to work has to do, again, with what I was talking about, which has to do with different values and different ideas about how the world works. Let's just take, for example, a Cuban man and a man who was born in Cuba, raised in Cuba, and a woman from the Midwest. Okay, so you have a very, very, very sexually Puritan culture, and a very, very sexually active and open culture. Now, some of you might be thinking Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, and that is exactly who I'm referring to. And I remember that Desi Arnaz actually made a comment when someone asked him about whether his wife was upset about him sleeping around. Was, well, why is she upset? They're just whores. This is the attitude within. No. I mean, this was his honest belief, because I mean, this is something that is present within Cuban culture. I mean, it is, you have the person that you are faithful to, or that you are emotionally faithful to, and then you have other people that you just shtup, right? That's the whole idea. And obviously, if you come from a Puritan culture, a sexually Puritan culture, that is not going to mesh well with a very sexually free society, and that's why that sort of stuff doesn't work. But and let's just take it a little bit further. Let's say that you have a guy from China marry a white woman from from San Francisco. Let's just say that's not going to work out very well. And I mean someone from China, not someone who grew up here, but someone from China. That's not going to work out very well, or even a second gen, because what's going to end up happening is that the very tradition oriented culture is going to not mesh very well with the revolutionary tendency of some schmuck from San Francisco. It just doesn't work because there's too many conflicting values. Same thing, by the way, might I add, from a lot of Latino cultures, with a lot of liberals from anywhere on the coasts. There's just the values are just too divergent. Whereas with Black people who've grown up in the U.S. for generations upon generations, though there are relatively major cultural differences, the very basic cultural ideas and cultural values still are present, at least for the most part, unless they've been ruined by academia, which basically tends to homogenize everyone and make them all some sort of mush in terms of cultural values of Marxism.
Yeah, I can't really think of any situations where our different backgrounds really came into conflict.
Yeah, exactly.
There was the one time we were at the beach and I was gonna hand her sunblock and she just kind of looked at me. Oh no, this is okay. I have one legitimate cultural clash. She's probably gonna be mad if I share this, but whatever. She loves me. So she had mentioned that we were like sitting on the couch, we were watching Netflix, and she had mentioned that she hadn't. She felt very off today because she didn't wash her hair in like I think 5 days or so, and she usually washes it like every 4 days. And I heard that and thought she said, "I haven't showered in 4 days," and I just kind of looked at her like, do you have a hygiene problem? It was pretty early in the relationship, so I wasn't sure. If I lift your arm, am I gonna like get a gas attack assaulted on my face? But no. Black women don't wash their hairs like every day in the way that I would assume Black males as well. I don't know for sure if this applies to them, but certainly for Black women, they don't wash their hair every day like white people do, because it'll dry it out and it might start to like fall off, because it's like a different kind of hair. And
right.
That's the only example I can think of where it actually clashed. But in terms of,
I mean, that's not even in terms of values. That's just in terms of very finicky cultural practices, which is very different. I mean,
I wouldn't just say cultural practices.
Well, it's not cultural. I mean, that's more that's more hygiene in terms of necessity for different bodies. But I mean, you get my point. I mean, that's less of a value issue and more of a cultural, or sorry, not a cultural, but a hygiene. What you do and what's expected. I mean, and I've had some things where, you know, I mean, my girlfriend and I have generally the same sense of humor. But I mean, sometimes they'll make cultural references and she won't get them because, of course, she grew up most of her life in Eastern Europe. So, you know, and it's not necessarily because she doesn't know all of American culture. It's that I'm making references to like Danny Kaye or the Marx Brothers, and she has no idea who the hell those people are because it's just way too far back. I mean, and sometimes she'll.
I don't even know who those people are, so I'm kind of on her side.
You don't know the Marx Brothers?
I don't.
The first, well, not the first, but one of the major comic groups in American history.
Nope, can't say I do.
All right, you know, you have to watch A Night at the Opera. Just watch, watch A Night at the Opera. It is hilarious. It's from, I believe, 1933.
Mm-hmm.
It's an old movie, but it's a really good movie. But anyway, I mean, but you get my point. I mean, I'm going to make very obscure references because I happen to love American culture, American film, American books, and you know, I mean, she'll sometimes make references to Russian culture or well, Russian culture or Romanian or Bulgarian and or Polish for that matter, and I just won't get the reference. I mean, the fact is that but those differences aren't in terms of values. We still share the same ideas about, you know, traditions, the same ideas about what's right and what's wrong. We still share the same ideas about how society should function and what the role of the government is, what the role of the individual is, etc. I mean, we don't have conflicting things in terms of we think that the collective comes before the individual, or or that one of us thinks that I don't know. I'm trying to think of that. You should basically try to strip as many people as possible, unless you get caught, kind of thing, which does exist in some cultures. I mean, imagine the culture clash with myself. If that were the case, that would be a massive, massive issue. But again, you know, that sort of value clash doesn't happen, simply because despite us coming from different backgrounds, there are still certain commonalities. And that's and in truth, I mean, basically, she's more American than most of the idiots that I live with, because I mean, most of them are dirty camuñaca who don't know a single thing about American culture. But I mean, we've discussed this before about the elite and the disjunct with the general society.
Yeah. So, how do you think? Do you think people might be treated differently if they get into insert here relationships, if they're male or female? Because in my experience, and this isn't gynocentrism, oh, the women's, but realistically, like, I've seen way more anger and frustration thrown at, in my circumstance, white women who date black men than the reverse. Like, it's way out of proportion. I've very rarely seen anyone get mad at like my demographic, like completely lopsided. And I've seen similar things in different racial communities as well. Like I was talking about with the really insecure dude from the bar earlier. I think I would have to be more worried about like her group's males then I would be worried about my group's males, because in this case, black males. But it could be any group, because I think they're gonna look at me dating her, and they're gonna get like that little, you know, reptilian voice popping up in their head saying your women are being taken from you. You need to get really aggressive and earn her back or something.
That's actually, by the way, a very common trope. The Chinese, there was a stereotype of the Chinese Shanghaiing to white women's and carting them off and raping them and having their wicked way with them. Same thing, by the way, with black people, Jews, white people in certain parts. Basically, every single group has had this stereotype lobbed at them for various reasons. But you know what's actually really interesting about that? In my case, no. It's never. I actually get a lot more flack than you would imagine for
I've
dating.
noticed that about Jews. I think
Yes,
it's I have
there's
observed that.
okay. So here's why. Do you know? Okay, so Catholics and most religions tend to have the lineage carry from the father. Not so in
Mhm,
Judaism.
mhm,
Judaism, all the lineage is carried from the mother.
mhm.
So if the mother's Jewish, the child's Jewish. If the mother is a non-Jew, the child is a non-Jew. So my dating someone who is a non-Jew means that any children I might have are going to be non-Jews unless they convert. In other words, very basically put, this is I am a bigger threat to Judaism than and the person who isn't Jewish, who is a woman, is a bit much bigger threat than the man who is Jewish. So basically, for example, a Jewish woman dating a non-Jewish man, that there's no problem. I mean, he's generally welcome into the community, no issue, yada yada yada. But any man who dates anyone who is obviously, as they would put it, a shiksa, yeah, you're in for a world of interesting times. I'll tell you that much.
I was I told you that there was like a Jewish community by my one of my
Uh-huh.
high schools, and I was chatting with this girl, this Jewish girl, and we didn't go
Orthodox.
out. We were just getting friendly.
Yeah.
And I did want to have sex with her. I'll admit it. Like it was on my mind. She was a very gorgeous young woman. What can I say? But
Oy vey, they're trying to control you, you know.
God, like it's the only time I think I've ever had like the parents of a girl that I've dated treat me with like suspicion. Like I've never seen it
Yeah,
from anyone else because and we weren't dating to be clear,
yeah.
although I wanted to. But it was like walking her. We lived like 3 blocks away from school, and we were walking back. We were just bullshitting, and we
Yeah.
get there, and she hugs me. He's like, "Bye." I'm like, "Okay, bye."
Yep.
And the scowl on that Jewish mom's face at me, it pierced my soul. I couldn't move for like a few minutes. And I
Yeah,
wasn't
we get
frozen,
you get
but it was
back.
like yeah, I can read her face. Like
Yeah.
she's not happy about this, and I could see the dad. Um, like the front of their house is like it's like glass window, so I can see into the house, and the dad's in the back. He's in the kitchen doing something. He's looking at me, and he doesn't look happy at all either.
Watch him. He might try to stab you with his long nose.
Yeah, and
Uh,
they
but
might. I think they might have said something to her. Come to think of it, because you know what?
oh no, they
I
will.
never walked her back after that.
Yeah, no. I mean, here's the thing. You are perceived as, it's not going to be you that they're going to go after, though. It's going to be her because, again, she has to keep it in the family, or sorry, not keep it in the family, keep it in the that's just wrong. Keep it in the tradition. Uh, Out of curiosity, was this girl Orthodox?
No, actually, she wasn't.
Oh,
No, she
interesting.
was. No, she was dressed in normal clothes.
Skirt, long skirt.
I think like a skirt and a tank top.
Oh, okay, then no, because a lot of you
No,
have
it was. It went down to like her knees or so.
okay, no. Then that's definitely not going to be it because most modern Orthodox women have the much longer skirts.
Yeah, they were one of the. I did see her in the like in the more formal outfits on Saturdays when she was like doing.
Yeah. Of course. But that's
On other
most.
days, they didn't dress like that. Generally, that community was very religious, but not their family.
Okay,
I
yeah,
don't know why.
then yeah, okay, then that's definitely. Yeah, I mean, but you see what I mean. I mean, even in that situation, it's not even that. But again, you're not perceived as a threat. It's her. It's she is actually the one perceived as a threat because she's the one not keeping it in the family. Again, I'm. But what she will go through, I mean, is nothing compared to what you have to go through with the community if you're a Jewish male and decide to date a non-Jewish female. My parents really don't care because I mean, my mother converted. My father, he's Jewish, but I mean, my mother converted. Um, so he didn't really get. As far as I know, he really didn't get the same issues because I mean, even though my mother isn't necessarily mostly not ethnically Jewish. I mean, she's still converted. But yeah, I mean, men who date non-Jewish women are definitely frowned upon, simply because of the way the Jewish societal structure works. I mean, it's stupid, but there you
Do you know
go. I mean,
why they trace lineage through the mother? I don't want to get into like a whole
yeah, obviously.
delve that deep into it.
No, I mean, as far as I know, I'm not completely sure, but I'm pretty sure it has to do with the womb, something having to do with the fact that the baby comes out of the womb, and therefore it incorporates the mother's ethnic juices or something. So I don't know.
Ethnic juices? Is
I,
that a scientific term?
I don't freaking know. I don't care. It's something that I'm using now. But you get my point. As far as I know, that's the rationale, but I'm not completely sure. Look, the rabbis do stuff where they take out the "not" in a word and then claim that it says something. It says the exact opposite of what the verse says. I mean, they do weird stuff to justify changing or certain laws. But yeah, I mean that's there are certain traditions that do cause that. So yeah, but no, it's very interesting because again, you point out the fact that you're perceived as a threat from the outside. It's very interesting because in as I said, in the Jewish circles, it's very much perceived as a threat on the inside. In fact, if someone marries outside of the tribe, as it were, you're supposed to actually hold an all-night vigil for them as though they have died. Or at least that's a tradition. I don't know if they still do it now. Probably in like the Hasidic community or something. I mean, it's really stupid. But I mean, the very and by the way, you get the same reaction. If you're a Jewish man and you say you're dating a non-Jewish female, and then, or it's the same reaction if you say I've never been to Israel, and you're more than like 15 years old. It's really funny. I say that to a lot of Jews just to piss them off. It's the funniest thing ever. But yeah, no, it's a very interesting phenomenon, and but as you point out, your experience as someone dating a black female as a white male, a fucking white male, yeah, fucking a white male, excuse me, is going to be very different because of the fact that you're perceived as an outsider threat, and therefore you're going to get the majority of the flack. It's not so much about keeping a tradition. It's more about, as you point out, the reptilian tribalism. That it's a less evolved form of like reptilian tribalism, because I mean, obviously the Jewish aspect is still tribalistic, but it's shall we say tribalism with actual doctrinal justification, however dumb that justification may be.
What was that? What justification?
Doctrinal justification in terms of mothers carrying the genetic lineage.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna look into why that is, because I can't think of any other. I'm sure there is. I just can't think of any other groups of people who do that. So
yeah, I can't either.
I'm just kind of going down my little list right here. So this is maybe more just me talking out loud, but do you think someone who is in an interracial or an intercultural relationship should expect less loyalty from like their own group? Like, do you think if you do that, then it's reasonable for, let's say, other Jews, if you were to marry with a non-Jewish woman, I think it'd be reasonable for them to turn around and say, well, you're free to do that, but I don't know what Jews do. But like, let's say you were hungry or something, and there was like a drought, and they're like, okay, we're just not gonna maybe rush to give you the food or the water as soon as someone else. That's a bit of an absurd example, but
yeah. No, I get what you mean. Here's the thing. I mean, one of the things is that though I agree with keeping tradition and making sure that culture is preserved, that is one of the main things that I really like is different cultures and studying them and analyzing how they work. but I mean, I also intensely dislike essentially the absolute ostracization of other cultures simply because reasons, essentially. The thing is, no, I don't think that is reasonable. And the reason why I don't think it's reasonable is because if the person still shares the same values as you, still shares the same things, is not, and his partner is not disrupting society, or her partner for that matter, is not disrupting the society, is not doing things which you shouldn't be doing, is not being an utter ass, then I fail to see why it is an issue. And especially if he is actually helping keep traditions, then I fail to see the issue. Now, again, if the person is turning their back on the tradition and is basically on tradition or on culture and saying, well, I mean, who cares? Then, I mean, it's kind of a crappy thing to do, but it's a little bit more understandable. It's still scummy as all hell and it shouldn't be done, but I can at least somewhat understand it. Nevertheless, I do think that people should be treated as individuals, not as, collective. So obviously, I must object to it in any case. But the fact is that, in terms of whether the person is married outside the tradition, I mean, that's really kind of a moot point. It doesn't matter if I marry someone who originally wasn't an American. I mean, I'm still an American, and I still hold American values, and I still will hold those values. And
Well, I was talking more like genetic heritage rather than.
Yeah, I'm aware, but what I mean is that, but my point is that to ostracize someone who still shares the same values, no matter who he decides to cohabit with, is sort of a dumb idea. And assumedly, he's going to teach his kids that too, unless his or her partner is a controlling ass.
Mm-hmm. So my thoughts on it are that I would understand why some people would think that. I mostly agree with you. I don't really, obviously, right? Like I don't see it as a justified or a reasonable justification to let's say ostracize somebody from a community. But I will say this, just to speak more from my own personal life. I can totally understand why, let's say there's white people who are very concerned about the demographics and all that stuff. I can totally understand why they're critical of me. Because at this current point in time, the white birth rate is pretty low, and it would be very helpful it's important to raise the white birth rate, and I'm not doing that. Like I'm doing my own thing. So I can understand why they get butthurt about it. I mean, I don't want to be too flippant, but it's like, well, I can see why. Like, I don't think it's immoral, and I don't even have much of an argument against that because I'm not actually familiar with what the argument is that interracial relationships are immoral. I've seen some people make the case, or I've seen some people say that and not really follow it up. So
yeah, I mean,
but I can concede that I'm inconveniencing white people right now. Like
there's one. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Here's my one issue. I don't like racial identitarianism, and here's why. I want you to lock in a room a Tutsi, a Hutu, a Zulu, and a Hausa. See how well they get along. I assure you that within about an hour, all of them will be dead. They're all black. I mean, they all share the same skin color. They should all get along perfectly well. No, they don't. Do the same thing with the European. Put a Russian, a Finn, a Greek, an Englishman, and a Frenchman. I do think that cultural values and organizing yourself around cultural values and I don't want to use the word identitarianism, but not even defining yourself by the culture, but sort of dealing with essentially aligning yourself with the culture that most suits you, especially if your lineage derives from the tradition. I can kind of understand that, but to do it racially, then that's kind of an issue. So
before you go much further,
yeah.
I don't know if those are good examples though, because you mentioned the African and the European groups, but and you said they'd all kill each other in the end.
Yeah.
True, but
or at the very least,
would they still be so hostile to each other if instead of it was Hutus, Tutsis, Hutus and whatever the other two groups were, and it was the Europeans. If it was Hutus and Tutsis and French people and Russians, I think that would be an important distinction, because in that context, I think you'd be more like, because here's the thing about identity. Identity, I think, to a large extent, is kind of defined by how do I say it? I was gonna say my environment, but that's not accurate. A society that's entirely Christian is not going to get angsty about Christianity. You know what I mean?
True.
A society that's entirely one race or one ethnicity is not going to think about it, because
right.
Why would a fish think about water? It's in the water. The water's everywhere. Now, if you threw it on a beach, then suddenly water becomes very, it becomes very keenly aware of how important water is.
Yes.
And I think if you put like different races of people, yeah, there's still the ethnic differences, of course. Nobody with any common sense would ever suggest that Europe has been a peaceful and prosperous continent for thousands of years, because only Europeans lived there, and Europeans are so nice and giving. No, obviously, right? But if you stick a group of Europeans who have disagreements with each other, and you put a group of, let's say, Asians next door, and maybe, yeah, sure, they have their own disagreements with each other, but now that there's an external problem, it's like, well, we might not like each other, but let's come together in-house and deal with the external threat.
I'm sorry, but I don't think that's going to happen, and here's why. The Frenchmen and the Russians have way more reason to disagree with each other than the Frenchmen and the Japanese do, right? What do they have? What do they have? I believe the expression is beef with each other about. Whereas the Russians and the French, they could argue for hours on end. Well, you guys made us with Napoleon. Yeah, well, you guys aligned with Germany in the first part of the Second World War. Stupid things like that. They have it's flimsy reasons, but they still have reason. So no, I think more has to do with historical relations between different ethnic groups. So, I'm hesitant to say that's really the case, because it's just evidence really doesn't bear that out, as far as I can see.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we're going to see, more and more of it as the turmoil.
Here's a better.
Go ahead.
Here's a better example, though. Put an Iranian, a Saudi, a Yemenite, a Russian, a Finn, and a Frenchman in the same room. Now, my guess is that the Finns and the French will put aside any differences they may have and align against the Russians. The Yemeni and the Saudi will align against the Iranian. I don't know why, but that's just my guess. Do you see my point? There are too many differences between these different ethnicities to really gang up on each other because of race. Let's say that, I don't know, a country which was founded by a white colonial power with white people, or with people with lighter skin flowing in, and it's viewed sort of as a colonial threat. Then everyone's going to sort of agree, that's BS. But I know what I'm talking about. That's right, Israel. I totally didn't mean to do that, but you get my point. Then they're both going to say, okay, this is BS. We want, this land belongs to someone who looks more like us. But has that really stopped Saudi Arabia and Iran from going at each other? Definitely not. And might I point out that, in fact, Saudi Arabia and Israel may very well align to get rid of Iran. I don't think that the tribalism is completely racial. I think it's much more in terms of smaller groups, in terms of ethnicities, in terms of actual tribe than race.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Okay, I think we're conflating states and individuals. I probably should have clarified that earlier. I was talking more in the case of individuals rather than the state of France. Whether a state allies itself with another state, there are a lot of different reasons aside from heritage, right? Of course, but I was talking more about individuals. If you take an individual Hutu and an individual Tutsi, and you put them in the same room with an individual French guy and an individual Russian, what I have personally found, and of course that's very anecdotal. I'm
Yeah.
not a scientist, but you know, I continuously find that, well, what differences they do have. Yeah, when they're alone, it'll come out, but in the presence of other groups, those individuals will the similarities of raw appearance, which, you know, we might, when people who are maybe more cerebral like myself, you know, have a hard time getting our heads around why that's important, but that's very important to a lot of people. That's just, there's a superficial similarity of appearance, and that for a lot of people, that's when you put them in proximity of people who don't have that similarity, the similarity will trump, let's say, a similar political goal or a similar value system. So
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess I can see that, but okay, perhaps Tutsis and Hutus are a bad example because those guys have major history. Like, you know the story of the Tutsis and the Hutus, right?
I know that.
Okay,
Just
basically,
like the Hutus, like when the
to give the TLDR, basically the Tutsis and the Hutus lived in a place called Rwanda, Urundi, and they started to fight because of various issues. And then the two countries split apart, and now they're still going after each other. And there was a massive genocide of Rwandans in Burundi, I believe, or was it Burundi, or was it of Burundians in Rwanda? I don't believe. I don't remember which one. But you got my point. There were massive catastrophes there. So perhaps they're bad examples. But let's just say a Zulu and a Hausa versus a Frenchman and a Russian. I mean, I guess I can see your point. Maybe, but it really all depends on which ethnicities you put together.
true,
I,
true.
so yeah. I mean, that really. So again, race does play a factor, but I would argue that if you have ethnic tensions, that trumps race. So again, if you put a Frenchman and a Frenchman and a Russian, or a Frenchman and a Brit in the same room as a Japanese person, they're not going to gang up on the Japanese person. But if you put a Frenchman and a Swede in the same room with a Japanese, they very well might. So you at least have yeah, you have a point there. I would say, but I think it's a little bit more nuanced than what you're saying. But relating this back to
Yeah, of course.
dating,
People will, you know, people make friends all the time across racial lines, and they won't
yeah,
follow, you know, maybe what their more reptilian instincts tell them to do. But I mean, the average, you know, the macro picture, I do see that as a
yeah,
phenomenon that's very common.
yeah, fair enough. But relating this back to dating, that's going to naturally also inhibit certain things. You know, you're not going to have, or at least it's very unlikely that you're necessarily going to have I don't know, a a Japanese person and a Chinese person necessarily marry. I knew a couple like that, but I know very few because I mean there's just way too much tension between the two, and it's much more likely that you're going to have a Black American and a white American get together if they're say both middle class. So I would assume your particular case, right? That's going to be a lot more likely because you again share certain common cultural experiences, and you share certain common cultural values. Whereas a Chinese person and Japanese person, they very well may look the same, but holy crap, are they different?
Mm-hmm. I will be right back. 1 minute.
No worries.
Back. Hello.
Awesome.
Cool.
Yep.
Uh,
But yeah, I mean, it really, as I said, it really all depends, I guess, on what exactly your particular um, uh, relation, what the particular cultural differences are. So, obviously, someone from Lebanon is going to a Muslim from Lebanon is going to have a relatively difficult time if he's really devoted, if he's culturally.
Sorry to cut you off real quick.
Oh,
Cater,
no, it's.
what analogy were you referring to? I'm just not sure what your comments were. You can go ahead.
Yeah. Basically, if you have a Lebanese person, a Lebanese Muslim who is definitely culturally that way, and has the same general cultural subgroups, excuse me, as the general Lebanese population has, and you have a guy from Mexico, that's not going to get along very well. But if you have a Lebanese person and a Syrian person, likely they're going to get along perfectly fine. Well, I don't necessarily know that actually because I just don't know enough about Syria versus Lebanon. But I would expect that there would at least be more compatibility. But I mean, yeah, I mean, the issue with interethnic relationships and interracial relationships, it really depends. If you're in a place like the U.S., then it really depends more on class than it does on race or on ethnicity. But if you're in,
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, we're not a very America's never been a very class conscious society.
oh no, that
Not
hasn't.
compared to let's say Britain, for instance, where they're very
Oh,
class
sure, sure,
conscious.
sure.
That's part of the reason why race has always been more of an issue, because that's how the fucking left takes over. Because
Well,
we're not
yeah.
super, obsessed with the rich. I mean, we're certainly more now, but I say for most of our history, it wasn't. It wasn't a way to rile up Americans.
No, it
Other
wasn't a way to
groups.
rile them up, but there certainly are differences. I mean, just to give an example of someone I know, I mean, this person married a person was middle class, definitely upper middle, married someone who was most definitely lower class. Let me put it this way: it didn't last because the values and the cultural attitudes were just too different. And these people are both Americans. They were both from the same general area, but it didn't work because what they valued and what they wanted out of life were just too disparate. So yeah, I mean, this is an issue. I think class is somewhat of a factor. In fact, possibly in some cases, in fact, maybe in many cases, more of a factor than race even. Uh, Simply, at least in certain cases. Now, if you're in England, then obviously, it's really going to. Then both are about as important as each other. If you're a Frenchman and you're definitely culturally French, with all the underpinnings of that, so more top-down method, tend to be more willing to be willing to have authoritarianism, like frogs tend to stick your nose up or tend to be more revolutionary, etc., then yeah, you're probably not going to get along very well with an English and you're middle class French specifically. You're not going to get along with someone who's middle class English.
Mm-hmm. So one of the last topics I wanted to kind of touch on was the subject of children
Yeah.
of two different backgrounds, which is a very significant part of some of the criticisms
Yeah.
of interracial, intercultural, interethnic, whatever relationships. And it's one that I also do have sympathy for, because
Agreed.
sympathy is a poor word. I understand the concerns, in the case of biracial people, there's a very high rate of mental illness, which I'm not familiar nearly enough with mental illness to tell you if that's because the different backgrounds has a genetic, like an imbalance in the brain when it comes to chemicals, or
Yeah.
mental illness as in they feel deeply insecure about themselves, and it manifests in things like depression, let's say. And it's why whenever I talk to other people who are in interracial relationships, they're always very surprised when I tell them that no, it's not just the same as when you're just dating within one group. These are things you have to think about. And to go on my own little tangent, I as a father, like I've spent a lot of time thinking, well, how am I gonna, prepare my children, to be more confident, so that this reality of theirs doesn't, cripple them. Because, and of course, it doesn't cripple, every person of biracial heritage, but it hurts a lot of them. Some of them get angsty about it when they're teenagers. Some never think about it at all. But for some people, they become angry leftists and complain about the white man when they go to college. And I want to try to avoid that. And it's
Well, that mental
yeah,
illness generally manifests itself in anyone who lives on the coast. I mean, let's be honest. But
I think it's something to do with the salt water. Just
yeah, probably.
gotta be
Hey,
something in the water.
that's why they were so salty about Trump. It was
I,
all they were burning off all the excess salt water.
Probably.
I mean, here I view my arrogance towards the coastal idiots as the equivalent
The
as their
survival
comeuppance.
mechanism.
No, well, that too, but mostly as their come up, because I'm one of those coastal asshats. I mean, I come from the coast. I've never lived anywhere outside of California, but I view it as sort of as their comeuppance for their arrogance towards the heartland. But yeah, in terms of children, you raise a very interesting point. I didn't actually know that about biracial children. But yeah, I mean that actually makes a certain amount of sense, because you do see a lot of biracial kids who are doing that. I wonder how accurate it is, obviously, and as you do. But the thing is that, yeah, children can become an issue, because then, even in my case, right? My grandmother is really not Jewish at all. I mean, she has some Jewish ancestry that we know of, but for the most part, she's a white European mongrel. Um, uh, it's a combination of Welsh, English, Huguenot, uh, Polish. I mean, it's all over the place. But the problem is, yeah, I mean, so in a sense, in terms of cultural aspect, I can actually give some insight into this, because I did live with my grandmother when I was a little bit younger, for at least for like not well, I didn't live for 2 years, but basically, um, I mean, it honestly, it really doesn't do much. I mean, as long as you're able to distinguish the culture, and you've had exposure to both cultures separately, uh, since you were young, you eventually understand what the values of the culture are, and you pick which one you think is more suitable. In my case, I decided that I was much more of an American than I was a Jew, and thus, even though I am ethnically and even somewhat culturally Jewish, I mean, generally, I consider myself first and foremost, well, after being an individual, obviously, an American. Um, but the problem is that you have to have this sort of understanding of what the cultural underpinnings were, what is the benefit, what is the downside, etc. And you have to allow them to make up their own mind about which side they're going to be on, or if they're going to be in a constant state of sampling a little bit from both, and being a little bit because at the end of the day, they're individuals. I mean, you can't really say they're going to be this way, or they have to be this way, or they have to obey this culture, because they're individuals. I mean, to say that you have to believe certain things is sort of, well, stupid.
Mhm. I would have to wonder, though, when you talk about sampling different cultures.
I'm using the obviously I'm being sort of flippant, but you get
Yeah,
my point.
yeah, no, I understand exactly what you mean, because that's what something I see a lot of interracial couples you say they're going to do, which I don't see. I see no obvious problem with this strategy, which is
Yeah,
basically just letting them, exposing them to both sides and letting them kind of pick and choose what they like.
but here's and sorry to interrupt, but I think there's one thing that I should add, which is that the important thing about that is to make sure that they understand the traditions and cultural things of both. Not because you really don't want to basically use it so that they're using it, one as a club to beat that group over the head with, they're oppressing the other group, as a lot of interracial Jews are want, and in fact, well, Jews in general are want to do. I believe I sent you that video, right? I mean, a lot of Jews are wont to say,
Um,
"Oh, I'm white, and you should feel bad," and then they'll turn around on the pin of the
oh
hat.
yeah. Oh my God, that's such a
Yeah,
freaking pet peeve of mine. Oh God.
no, I mean it's, and the guy is completely, the guy who I showed you is completely right. I mean, this is very much a very big characteristic. I mean, the only time I really go do that is when I have some guy who's a non-Jew who's criticizing me for making an edgy Holocaust joke. Uh, I mean that it's always fun to see their faces when they realize that they're talking to a guy who. But I mean, then again, I don't consider myself to be either white or Jewish. I just consider myself to be an American and make jokes about both. The only time it's ever relevant, me being white or Jewish, is when I'm talking about what. The only time it's really relevant that I'm Jewish is when I'm talking about culture. But anyway, or when I want to make a joke. But anyway, the problem is that you have to have the interracial child or biracial child understand the cultural traditions of his heritage, and then allow him to decide, so that he doesn't just use it as a club to beat other people over the head.
What do you mean a club to beat over the head? Sorry, cut out there for a second.
As in, basically, saying something like, "Oh, you're oppressing me because I'm black, Asian, Hispanic, and I'm part this, but I'm also part white. So you should listen to me because you're more likely to listen to me if I'm a white dude. But you're also oppressing me because I'm this other thing."
Oh yeah. I mean that touches on a very interesting point. What's the name of that Hitler documentary? Greatest story never told.
Yeah.
I was I was originally going to do a live stream reaction of me watching it for the first time, but I don't think YouTube would appreciate that, so I decided not to. I didn't watch. I watched parts of it, and so I haven't seen the whole documentary. I guess in the interest of fairness, right? I haven't seen the whole thing, but they got to a certain point where they were talking about how Hitler had a lot of half Jewish Nazis, and how they were valued members of the Nazi Party, and it's presented as like this way to show that Hitler is he wasn't that bad, see, but I had to think, I had to think, what kind of people, like if you're half Jewish and you join the Nazi Party, I I have to think, I have to wonder if maybe you were more let's say violent or aggressive or just
No.
disliking of Jews than, let's say, a pure blood 100% Bavarian phenotype Nazi, because
No.
you would have had to well, I think they would have projected a little bit that their own like security insecurities, and they would have felt the need to sort of lash out, because another example.
Okay. Here's. I'm sorry to interrupt again. No. Go ahead. Finish your thought, and then I'll.
Well, this is a TV show, so it's not quite the same as real life. But I remember watching uh, what was the Netflix show that people got mad at?
Dear White People.
Dear White People. Yeah. Well, originally that was a movie,
Yeah,
actually.
I saw the movie. I actually
And I
really
saw.
liked the
Do you
movie.
remember the angsty SJW chick? How she
Yeah, the
turns
one
out
who
to
was
be.
biracial.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, I see that as a potential issue as well. That's something you are going to have to think about. Is that if you don't do a very good job at instilling them with a sense of confidence,
Yeah.
then they're going to turn into either they're going to feel the need to be more aggressive and more assertive for their
Yeah.
for lack of a better word, adopted group, because they want to improve themselves. I think instinctually, on an instinctual level, they're going to feel the need to prove themselves that they deserve to be part of this group of people. What were you going to say?
Right. Okay. This is something that a lot of people don't get. One of the things that I get really annoyed at is I have to constantly defend, or not defend, but explain the nuance within Nazi Germany to a lot of people who basically have bought into the narrative that essentially Hitler was pure evil and nothing he did was even remotely defensible, and if Hitler liked dogs or Hitler was a vegetarian, therefore we have to hate all vegetarians. I'm not saying, for any morons in the audience, I'm not saying that Hitler was good. He was an absolutely despicable, evil, and a little bit of a git, shall we say. Um, I should probably explain that. In Russian, Hitler is called Gitler. So one of the things that I would always say was Hitler was a little bit of a git. But that's beside the point. In Nazi Germany, one of the things that people fail to realize is that you joined the Nazi Party not because you agreed with the values, not because you needed, but because it was a couple of things. One, you wanted to advance in society. Very much like Soviet Russia, if you wanted anything done, you had to be part of the government. This is the nature of all authoritarian societies. This is the way they get members. It's not because they're necessarily popular, it's because it's the only way they make it so that the road goes through them, essentially. Thus, you're going to have a lot of people who don't necessarily ascribe to the Nazi doctrine, but are using it either as protection for their family, some of whom were Jewish, by the way, might I point out. Like, they have a Jewish sister-in-law. So what they do is they join the Nazi Party to make sure that they don't get gassed. I mean, honestly, I think that's perfectly freaking reasonable. If you can't escape, you can't do anything. Of course they're going to do that. If you're a half Jew, hell yeah, you're going to join the Nazi Party, because that's the only way to protect yourself. If you have, you know what? In that case, I do not give a crap what group you belong to. It's every man for himself. At the end of the day, you have to remember, I mean, even though I do consider myself an American, at the end of the day, I'm an individual, and that above all else. In other words, you do what you have to do to protect yourself, unless you're directly harming someone else. I mean, if the Nazis tell you you have to kill, 50 Jews with a gunshot to the head, or turning on the gas, then sure, I object to that, and I find that morally despicable. But you know what? If you have a gun pointed to your own head, even if I do regard that as somewhat morally questionable, I can still at least somewhat understand one's sense of self-preservation. I think self-preservation is a very noble characteristic, and people shouldn't be saying, well, obviously the documentary was presenting these people was using them to present Hitler in a more positive light. But a lot of people will go and say these evil half Jews were colluding with Hitler against their own people. Oh my God, the humanity. It's just, what the hell would you do? I doubt you have the courage that, well, a lot of these SJWs are so stupid that they would have the courage and would just go, you're like triggering me. Like, I can't like betray my own people. I mean, if Trump were to become literally Hitler and gas every Mexican, I can assure you that the people who are half Mexican, or just any of the SJWs, would end up going along with him because they're freaking cowards. I mean, they say, oh, I would stand up to him in that case. Actually, they would, because they're so stupid that they wouldn't have any sense of self-preservation and would end up just basically complaining the whole time. But you get my point. I mean, I actually bear very little grudge against them, because, I'm an individualist. I believe you do what's necessary to protect your own ass. You worry about yourself first.
I mean, about myself, well, all right, we won't get back into that topic. I actually have to get going. Sorry, I have to end it a little bit shorter than we originally thought.
Yeah, no worries. I'm sorry about the long rants that were kind of off topic, but you know me.
Thanks for listening, guys. Appreciate it. Feel free to leave feedback. If you want, chime in. I'm still pretty used to live discussions, so I'm still trying to get the hang of it. Make sure I'm staying on topic and staying focused. But thanks everyone for listening. Thanks, Nathaniel, for chatting with me.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.